The Seven, deities and gods worshipped throughout Teyvat. These individuals known as Archons, and they go by many names and aliases. But one thing they all have in common is they are guardians and rule over their respective nations, each corresponding with one of the 7 elements of Teyvat. And although the Archons are the apex and top of the food chain within Teyvat, and are quite literally deities and gods to the mortals and creatures they govern, they feel remorse, pity, anguish, grief. They make mistakes, and in a lot of ways, they're just as human as everyone else. They have been suffering just as much, and have endured thousands upon thousands of years of anguish, war, and being a puppet for the current heavenly principles. So let us take a deep dive into the Archons both past and present in Genshin Impact, and start where it all began, Mondstadt, who has had the same Archon since the beginning and the end of the Archon War, a drunken bard named Venti, who also goes by the name Barbatos. He represents freedom and the animo element, and he is actually the 2nd oldest member of the 7. Barbatos actually had some pretty humble beginnings, and it's not exactly known how old Venti actually is. But around the time during the Archon War, Barbatos was simply an entity, a little elemental wisp among the 1,000 winds, had no divine power, no authority, but still answered the plea of the people within Old Mondstadt, now located in Stormterror's lair. During the Archon War, a great struggle took place between the god of storms, who occupied Old Mondstadt, and the wolf god of Wolvendome, Boreas. This conflict caused the land of Mondstadt to be engulfed by ice and snow, leading this period to be known as the Age of Kings. Now, around 2,600 years ago, the Gunhildr clan, the same clan Jean is from today, decided to leave the capital of Old Mondstadt, sick of being ruled over by the god of storms. They did not agree with Dakaraban's rule, but them leaving the capital meant they had to contend with relentless blizzards and storms. But their constant prayers that their clan would not be snuffed out in the harsh elements actually did not go unanswered. Now, it has been said in Genshin that gods gain power from faith and belief, and the Gunhildr clan was not forsaken, for a little wind spirit drew power from this faith and belief, making it stronger, helping it make a small shelter and protect the Gunhildr clan. And as you could probably already guess, this little wind spirit would become Barbatos. This same wind spirit sometime later would befriend a nameless bard, and this bard wished to see the world outside of the capital city that was closed off. And soon to follow, this bard would raise a rebellion, trying to liberate the capital. It should also be noted too that the god of storms was actually taken back and surprised that the people rose in revolt, as this god thought it was loved, only to learn that it was hated, and this would cause a great battle, where the rebellion would be successful. But unfortunately, the little wind spirit would grieve, as the bard friend that it made and started the rebellion with would die in the fight, fatally wounded, and would eventually pass away. Boreas the wolf god also chose to relinquish their own life and sacrifice themselves in order to put an end to the storms, but also to avoid becoming the Archon themselves. And thus, the title of Animo Archon would be gifted to this little wind spirit, and it would ascend to godhood to fill the position. And immediately, the first thing that this wind spirit did after gaining its new powers as Archon was take the appearance of its bard friend that perished during the battle, henceforth taking the exact shape that we know Venti to be today. The Gunhildr clan would rejoice as the wind spirit that once aided their clan, banished to the colds and the storms, would ascend to the god of freedom, the first ever Animo Archon, and to this day would be its most loyal family and followers. Now, Mondstadt in its old days was a much harsher place to live, much more frigid and cold. The whole region looked a lot similar to Dragonspine, but after becoming Archon, Barbatos made the land much more environmentally friendly to humanity, using his friend's lyre and summoned wind to blow the ice and snow away, splitting the mountains drastically and changing Mondstadt's terrain and landscape. Many of the eastern mountains in Mondstadt were scattered into the ocean, although certain peaks are still tall enough to be seen invisible today, such as Musk Reef, Pylos Peak, and the Golden Apple Archipelago, also using storms to flatten the cliffs and make valleys. And just like that, Mondstadt turned from a snowy wasteland to a very fertile and green grassland, easily inhabitable, lots of food and crops, and to this day, people from Mondstadt have never had to worry about surviving, and would later on be known to produce some of the best wines the world has ever seen. The people from Mondstadt would also construct a new city on Cider Lake, and would always host a Windbloom festival to commemorate the animal Archon and their accomplishments to the people of Mondstadt. All of the other outskirt clans that survived in the frozen wastelands, like the Lawrence clan and others, would eventually establish themselves and integrate within Mondstadt society, but this would give rise to an aristocracy era within Mondstadt after many years. The Archon War went on for thousands of years, but 2,000 years ago, the Archon War officially wrapped up, with the final seat of the Seven being claimed. Barbados decided to wander the other nations of Teyvat, allowing the aristocracy within Mondstadt to grow and become unhinged. During these times though, he would often visit with the other Archons. They would often get together in Liyue for some drinks and visiting, even being acquainted with most of the Adepti and helping to cure Zhao of his corruption through his music and his flute, and visiting the other nations and their Archons as well. Because the Archon War was so long and so much death and suffering, Barbados believed through his music he could help the land and the people heal, not just in Mondstadt but in all nations. So he would travel around playing his music, and this would draw the attention of one newborn animal dragon, who would then be named Dvalin. Dvalin grew curious upon hearing Barbados' music, and despite the animosity between dragons and gods for many years, they became close friends and allies, and also teaching Dvalin how to communicate with humans. Nobody in Mondstadt would ever see Dvalin as a threat. And seeing that the nation was stable, Barbados believed that the independence of people should maintain, and that the will of the people should be ruled by themselves, truly embodying freedom. This is one of the explanations to his many disappearances for long periods of time. But obviously we know, around 1,000 years ago, when he would return, the Lawrence clan and the aristocracy era would be in full fledged, where a wandering natlan tribe would be taken captive, and a member of that tribe named Vanessa would be pitted in the gladiator's ring. And when Venti went to investigate, she would stand up for the bard, not even realizing who it was. This would be the beginning and the catalyst of Vanessa's rebellion against the rich nobles, where they would pit Ursa the Drake against her and her clan, slaughtering many innocent lives. Some members of her clan that weren't even warriors. Barbados would then reveal himself, empowering Vanessa, and she would ultimately defeat Ursa the Drake. This would start another uprising in the city, and the rich nobles would eventually be overthrown. The Gunhildr and Ragnvandr clans would also join Vanessa, allying themselves with her, and once the situation stabilized, she would become the first ever Grand Master, and the Knights of Avonius would be established. And from this day to current day, dedicating themselves to uphold freedom of Mondstadt and everyone that lies within it. At some unknown point in time after this, Venti would have a short run-in with a secret organization known as the Hagson Circle, a group of extremely powerful witches. They would challenge the Animal Archon himself. He was able, however, to convince them through his music that war is not the answer, and from that day on they would have a truce, allowing them to hold gatherings at Falcon's Coast. Sometime after 500 years ago, the 5 sinners of Conria would get together and unleash one of the greatest disasters that would ever befall Teyvat. And one of these 5 sinners, Rhine-Daughter, created a dragon named Durin. This dragon appeared in Mondstadt, releasing toxic fumes and black rain. Barbados would then again awake from his slumber to answer the people's cries for help, summoning Dvalin to help battle against the Dark Dragon. Barbados decided on Dragonspine as a battle location due to it being uninhabited. Dvalin, being empowered by Barbados through his music, defeating Durin, taking one massive bite and chunk out of Durin's neck. To recover from his injuries, however, from the battle, Dvalin would go and sleep in the old God of Storm's tower, in Old Mondstadt, now known as Storm Terror's lair, and Barbatos would then after be summoned to Conria by Greater Lord Rukkhadevata for the final battle against the Conria and the monsters rifting out of the abyss. The gods would be victorious, sustaining quite a few losses however. We'll get into that in a bit. It's left incredibly ambiguous exactly what transpired during this great conflict, but it is said that the remaining Archons that weren't killed during the Cataclysm were severely traumatized by the Heavenly Principles. The Tsaritsa cut all ties with Barbatos, and it is said around this time that the people of Mondstadt now forgot the Four Winds, and didn't even recognize Barbatos' appearance anymore. Most likely something to do with Istaroth, who also was worshipped in Mondstadt for many years. From here we know what happened. Barbatos awakens several months before the start of the game. Dvalin, during his fight with Durin, would slowly be corrupted from abyssal corruption, causing and wreaking havoc within Mondstadt. Very out of character for Dvalin. Barbatos would try to rectify this. This is where we first see Barbatos at the very beginning of the game, and our abyssal purifying ability would come in super handy throughout the Archon quest in Mondstadt, helping to fight back the Abyss Order, free Dvalin from this curse and this corruption, and ultimately save the City of Freedom and the City of Mondstadt. However, the 8th Fatui Harbinger La Signora would ambush us out of nowhere at the end of the Archon quest and take the Animo Gnosis. It is left up to speculation whether Barbatos let this happen or not. All the Archons are pretty easygoing with relinquishing that authority and title. Venti would then go to Windrise, the great tree in Mondstadt, his favorite place to think, giving us an explanation on Allogenes, the Gnosis, and our next quest and destination in our journey. Now before I move on to Rex Lapis, is Venti connected to Istaroth, the god who was worshipped in Mondstadt at the Thousand Winds? I would say definitely a descendant, definitely linked to the Thousand Winds. As far as Venti being the weakest Archon, that just isn't plausible to me, and I don't want to repeat every single point I made in this video. I go into way more detail on that connection, but regardless, Venti still needs an Act 2 of his story, and like the rest of the Archons, is so shrouded in mystery. But if gods are empowered through faith, there is no region in Genshin that has more belief in their Archon, and more faith, and a church dedicated to it than Mondstadt. Just some food for thought. But let's move on to Liyue, and the god of Geo. Now, the Geo Archon has only gone by the name Zhongli, his retired mortal alias, for a short while, but he has had many titles throughout his reign. The Geo Archon, the god of contracts, the god of history, the lord of rock, the groundbreaker, and the warrior god, and my personal favorite, the god of counterfeiting. Seriously, let me just pause the video here for a second. Zhongli spends everyone else's money like it's nobody's business, happily letting everyone else take the bill for whatever he purchases or does. And yet, he's the god that makes the Mora. He makes all the Mora. He is running the most illegal counterfeiting operation in Teyvat. But because he's the Geo god and the god of contracts, when we do it, we go to jail for life. But when he does it, no problem. And he still spends everyone else's money and lets them take the bill. Unreal. Can't believe this. Like seriously though, imagine the god of Geo that makes all the money saying, hey, I forgot my wallet, can you get this one? Like, unbelievable.
I will have order.
Rex Lapis does have the most mysterious origin. We have no idea where he came from. It's said that he might have descended to Teyvat over 6,000 years ago, and even before the Archon War. Morax was already known as the Lord of Geo, and was close to a few adepti, Guizhong being one of them, and the God of Dust, forming a settlement within the Gili Plains. The Lord of Geo was also on great terms with all the other adepti, like Madame Ping, Cloud Retainer, Mountain Shaper, and Mooncarver, just to name a few. However, in the earlier days of the Archon War when it broke out, Guizhong would perish in a battle that laid waste to the Gili Plains. Afterward, Morax moved their people south, and this would be where they established the now known Liyue Harbor. To help protect his city, he formed a contract with the Adepti to defend the harbor as he continued waging war against the many enemies and gods throughout Liyue, slaying the great god Osial in the process, throwing divine stone spears at it that would now create the stone forest just outside Liyue Harbor, also killing a god known as Chintz that dwelt within the now known Chintza village. It is said that this god was a great serpent deity, and Morax also slayed a god that Zhao answered to, being Zhao's former master. Sadly, the god of salt, too gentle of a god, would be slain by her own people. Some point after this, Morax would befriend a massive geo-dragon and bishop named Ajdaha, who they would become lifelong friends. But eventually, over the years, erosion would kick in. Erosion is the term that they use. It is essentially dementia for gods in Teyvat. Only they become much more hostile, causing Morax to have to seal his old friend below a great tree. Over thousands of years of conflict in the Archon War and defeating other gods, Morax gained a very brutal and bloody reputation, and all of these god remains buried underground. But you cannot kill the soul of a god. The essence and the souls of these dead gods are immortal, and their desires for revenge and lust for life seeped into the earth, resulting in monsters and plagues. Morax's now infamous group called the Yaksha would be tasked with helping him battle this endless subduing of ancient gods. The Yakshas would do this for years, but it would slowly corrupt them all, with the exception of Bodacious, who would eventually give his life in the Cataclysm to help keep the monsters sealed down there and never reach the light of day. Zhao is the last remaining Yaksha, still fulfilling his contract and duty to the Geo Archon. Morax was the first to emerge as one of the 7 victors, and because of this, Morax remembers vividly each other Archon when they eventually rose to emerge and become victorious. But sadly enough, millennia later, Morax and Barbados are the only remaining 2 of the original 7. Their other comrades died and replaced by this point. We really actually don't know much about Morax's involvement with the Cataclysm. It's said that he knows the truth, but is reluctant to reveal that. Somebody made a contract with him in which he won't disclose what happened. After the Cataclysm, there was one Adepti that asked his permission to marry a mortal. So an Adepti and a mortal had a kid, and that kid would be Yanfei. Zhongli would sanction this and view this actually as a great step forward in the future between humanity and Adepti. We eventually know that he would fake his own death at the Rite of Passage. That pretty much leads us to the beginning of Liyue's Archon quest at the Rite of Descension. Rex Lapis is allegedly assassinated, where we're one of the common suspects, and his body was taken to the Golden House by the Liyue Chising. We obviously know that he took the alias of Zhongli and instigated most of the events throughout the entire Liyue Archon quest, helping aid the Tsaritsa and the Fatui Harbingers to orchestrate the current situation in Liyue. He wanted to see if Liyue could survive without the protection of its Archon, because he did intend to retire. The Fatui Harbingers orchestrated this entire event, not even telling Child and letting him be in on it, in order to help Rex Lapis see this through. And his reward for them and their end of the contract was to receive the Geonosis from him. Zhongli refused to give the Gnosis prior to seeing this plan through, in case he did need to intervene and stop things with Osial before they got out of hand. At some point after handing over the Geonosis, Morax used an ancient Adepti art to inform Ning Wang that he was still alive, but had chosen to step down as Geo Archon, and this would clear our name through any suspicion of his murder. Now he works at the Wangsheng funeral parlor, working for his boss Hu Tao, blending in with Liyue's society. And oh yes, he might not make Mora anymore, but he has a lifetime worth of savings that he made for himself. And even though he has a bigger bank account and savings than anyone in Liyue combined, does he still bum money off people? You bet he does. As for the mysteries shrouding Zhongli's origins, well, that we can only speculate on. Is he a descender, or is he simply just old enough that the history books don't know his true origin? I guess only time will tell. But that will bring us right to Inazuma, the Raiden Shogun, or her actual name Raiden A, who actually has a twin sister Archon, Raiden Makoto. The funny thing is, outside of a select few, not too many people knew that they were separate individuals, two sister Electro gods, identical twins, but nobody knew this, except for a few trusted close friends of theirs that were powerful yokai. And honestly, Inazuma prospered because of this. Raiden Makoto was perfect at handling the nation's affairs, the more diplomatic and political side of being an Archon and ruling over a nation. But Raiden A was the powerhouse of the two, acting as her sister's sword and enforcer. It's honestly hard to keep track of how many gods Raiden A has put into the dirt herself, but that was just the way of the world back then, especially during the Archon War, when all of the gods in each nation fought over a Gnosis to rule as an Archon for Celestia. And Inazuma was no different, only Raiden Makoto might have been the best candidate to be the Archon, but Raiden A was the one that put her there, slaying countless other gods that would challenge them. Ironically, nobody would even know that they're two different individuals, which is sort of funny. They just thought Raiden Makoto was the perfect Archon in both delegating and strength. But Raiden A was happy to do this for her sister, and they were very close. And the Nation of Eternity prospered for many years, until the Cataclysm, which happened 500 years before the game starts. The big catastrophe with Conria and the monsters that came rushing out of the abyss. The Cataclysm was a catastrophe that took place in every single region simultaneously. And this would be the beginning where Raiden A would truly experience PTSD, and that the only thing that separates the gods, even the most mighty Archons, from actual mortals is really not that much. Gods experience PTSD, loss, anguish, all of these things. So let's break down what exactly happened. To backtrack a little bit, Orobashi, the great serpent god, fled to the Dark Sea and ended up in Enkanomiya, and the people that were banished there worshipped Orobashi as their deity until Orobashi, towards the end of the Archon War, would bring the people of Enkanomiya back to the surface and form Watatsumi Island so they could live there in peace. But Orobashi was sentenced to death by Celestia for learning forbidden knowledge, reading the books before Sun and Moon, and learning hidden secrets. And because it was sentenced to death and did not wish death upon its own people, it went and attacked Yashiori Island and was ultimately slain by the Raiden Shogun, Raiden A, at the very end of the Archon War, leaving a huge gouge in this island where Orobashi's dead remains can be seen to this day, and the island now plagued with corruption of a dead god, corrupting the land and everyone that goes here. So now, the island isn't even inhabitable anymore. People go mad here. And because Orobashi was an expert and taught its people to smelt, which is a process related to mining, it's heavily speculated that Orobashi might be a god that Rex Lapis chased out of Chenyu Vale, being that smelting is a big thing there as well. But either way, because the Electro Archon killed Orobashi, the people of Watatsumi refused to acknowledge the Electro Archon after killing its deity, and there would be lots of rebel wars between the people of Watatsumi and the rest of Inazuma. And these conflicts would be when the first friend of Raiden A would perish, a Tengu yokai and the ancestor of Kujo Sara. And then it wouldn't be till many years later, when the Cataclysm would hit Inazuma, that her Oni friend, the ancestor of Arataki Ito, would be swallowed by an abyssal beast and corrupted, turning her evil, causing her to attack her own friend and nation, forcing the Raiden Shogun to slay her best friend. And then finally her Kitsune yokai friend, the ancestor of Yaimiko, would be the last to perish during the Cataclysm. All three of her friends now gone, but this wouldn't be the last tragedy, as Raiden Makoto would join the other Archons in Sumeru to make a final stand against the Cataclysm and Conria's mechas. During this huge catastrophe, 3 Archons perished. The final death, her twin sister, that would truly send Raiden A over the edge. But no one would ever know, because not many people knew the truth. that there was actually two twin sister Archons. Yae Miko would be born sometime after the Cataclysm, and would ultimately befriend Raiden A and be her closest confidant, helping her run the nation's affairs because Raiden A was not suited for this task. She was a warrior, a fighter, not a ruler, so Yae Miko took most of that burden as well as her gnosis, and Raiden A, in her anguish and grief, fearing Celestia, the Heavenly Principle's wrath and eternity, often hid in the plane of Euthymia, avoiding her responsibilities. But before she did this, she would create a puppet that could hold a gnosis, could stand in her place and run the nation's affairs. Scaramouche was the first prototype, but was then discarded. She would finally perfect her design before officially retiring to the plane of Euthymia, allowing her puppet to rule in her stead. Only this puppet and its ideal programming of eternity was flawed, becoming a tyrannical ruler and dictator, confiscating visions and anything that could threaten eternity. If you did not oblige, you were met with the Muso no Hira no Tachi, and Yae Miko being the one person that most people now turn to. And this is ultimately the situation that we're left when we first step foot in Inazuma, where visions are being confiscated and the traveler has to overcome obstacles in order to free the nation and help snap Raiden A out of her funk. With the assistance of Yae Miko and many other companions in Inazuma, we are able to do this, Kazuha even being able to stop her blade point blank with his own two hands. Because Raiden A neglected her duties for so long and hiding away, the Fatui had an easy time manipulating the events in Inazuma with the distribution of delusions and just orchestrating the catastrophe and the current state of the nation. Eventually, the Traveler with Yae Miko's help was able to inspire and change the mind of Raiden A, helping her come to terms with the reality that we are in. And although she fears the Heavenly Principles and just wants to abide by the laws in order to avoid their wrath, witnessing what happened to Conria, Inazuma eventually turns a new leaf and Raiden A comes out of the plane of Euthymia and out of hiding. However, the Shogun puppet that she herself created would be a problem, and they would have to duke it out for 500 long years in another plane, hidden under the sacred Sakura, the same sacred Sakura tree that A used during the Cataclysm to help destroy the monsters and the corruption in Inazuma and the ley line. Raiden Makoto, however, after her death, placed some of her consciousness in the shrine and the great tree. And after defeating the Shogun puppet in a great duel that lasted 500 years, Makoto's consciousness spawned from the tree and apologized to her sister for leaving her so suddenly during the Cataclysm. And before Raiden Makoto's consciousness finally faded away for good, she handed Raiden a seed of the sacred Sakura. A believing that Istaroth was involved with Makoto in some way and involved in the creation of the sacred Sakura. And without her intervention, Inazuma would have ultimately been consumed by the darkness and the abyss. So in its own weird way, the same sacred Sakura tree and seed that Raiden A used to help protect Inazuma was ultimately always protected by the less combative and powerful Raiden Makoto all along, even through time, and now can plant the seed of the sacred Sakura under the great shrine in the future so that it will ultimately help them in the past. Raiden Makoto playing 4D chess here to help her nation and her sister even from death in the future. And this is how the sacred Sakura would even form to begin with. Now Raiden A in present day strives to do better, regain the trust of its citizens and the yokai that live in Inazuma. Many years of tyranny have tarnished a lot of people's faith in the Electro Archon, but they're coming around. And Raiden A is ready when the final war comes against Celestia. Our sibling has recently told us that the Heavenly Principles will awaken soon, and Raiden A pretty recently already mentions that she's ready, and Inazuma will be ready for when the final war and the Great War begins. Raiden A is the perfect example of a god that has such human qualities, and that even though an all-knowing archon and deity is supposed to be just that, a deity in the eyes of a mortal, they really do have so many human qualities, and they suffer just like we do when they lose someone they love. One of the biggest failures of the Raiden Shogun, in my opinion, is the creation of Scaramouche, allowing him to be manipulated and experimented on by the Fatui, the countless people he's murdered in his grief, trying to find purpose in this world, and ultimately kind of passing the buck to another Archon to correct and fix your mistakes, trying to rehabilitate the Wanderer. a result of her own neglect and PTSD, but she is on the right track now. Let me ask you something. What does it mean to be an Archon? Is it simply to govern and rule over your nation and hold dominion over your lands? Or is it to protect the people that worship and follow you, the citizens that live within your lands? Give your life if need be, in order to save everybody, not only from your nation, but the entire world. Gods, Archons, and people alike. That is exactly what these next two Archons, the Dendro Archons from Sumeru, the gods of wisdom, and the avatars of Irminsul embody. And one of the most tragic stories in Genshin Impact, because not only did Greater Lord Rukkhadevata sacrifice everything to save everybody, not just her own nation, but nobody will even remember what she did. There is no glory, no statues being built or people worshipping because her memory is gone completely. But she truly embodies what an Archon should be. So let's go over the gods of Sumeru. Greater Lord Rukkhadevata and Lesser Lord Kusanali, who also goes by the name Bur. Now, Sumeru as a region was much different back then, and we don't actually know how old Rukkhadevata actually is. Younger than Zhongli for sure. We do, however, know that Rukkhadevata is the original Dendro Archon, so she probably is quite old. What happened in Sumeru exactly? Sumeru was a lush jungly area, but after that battle in Celestia took place, one of the divine nails cast by the heavenly principles to mend the land devastated and transformed most of Sumeru into a desert known as the Great Red Sand. This would also suppress the Dendro Archon Apep, forcing it to adapt to the desert environment. However, earliest records we have of Rukkhadevata suggest that she held dominion over a little part of the rainforest that still thrived under her domain, and this sectional rainforest probably survived due to her powers over nature. During this time, it is even unclear if elemental beings from the light realm were even regarded as gods. So in this time frame, Rukkhadevata was known as a princess or priestess, whose wisdom was renowned throughout the land. Because Rukkhadevata is at least around when the dragons and the divine nails were being cast, but younger than Morax, I would pinpoint her around 5,500 years old, give or take. Definitely over 5,000 years old, but not as old as Morax, so that gives us a bit of a time frame. She also has that elven-like appearance similar to Klee's mother Alice, and the rooster, so whether she's from this ancient elven-like race or not, we don't know, but it is definitely suggested so by her design. There was a Seelie survivor who lived under the Primordial One before the Divine Nail was cast, before that big war in the heavens, living under the Primordial One, a Seelie named Nabu, also known as the Goddess of Flowers, a survivor who heard about Rukkhadevata's wisdom and sought her out. These two would become really good friends in the many years to come, as well as King Deshard, who ruled over the desert area, the Scarlet King. Nabu was always impressed by Rukkhadevata's answers to her riddles, and always sought out Rukkhadevata's wisdom for advice. These three would be known as the three god kings of Sumeru, and would rule over Sumeru's entire region together, working together and complementing each other's weaknesses and strengths, and for a long time Sumeru prospered under these three. Sumeru would prosper for thousands of years with their three god kings working together and forming a very close friendship and bond. But 2,000 years ago, a war known as the Archon War would take place, where all the gods and all of Teyvat would fight for a gnosis and a seat at the Seven. However, Sumeru was a different case, because King Deshard, being the strongest obvious choice and the best puppet choice for Celestia to choose, would offer him a gnosis and the position as Dendro Archon. But King Deshard would outright refuse for multiple reasons. One being that Sumeru already thrived having three gods work together, and the nation just benefited more for this. And secondly, King Deshard did not trust Celestia and its motives. For thousands of years leading up to this Archon War 2,000 years ago, Deshard and Nabu formed a very close friendship, and Deshard took interest in Celestia, the Primordial One, the old world that Nabu lived in, forbidden knowledge, and the secrets that lie within this world, the truth of it all, and beyond. Nabu warned Deshard that dabbling in forbidden knowledge, well, was forbidden, and would only bring destruction and death. but admired Deschert's tenacity and his will to rebel against Celestia, so she agreed to help him against Rukkhadevada's better judgment, being the god of wisdom and knowing exactly how this would play out. This would be the beginning of this trio and its downfall. At some point, the goddess of flowers foresaw the coming cataclysm and realized that humanity might not survive on its own, and she even foresaw her own demise and understood her own fate to die leading King Deschert on his path of understanding forbidden knowledge. Rukkhadevada might just be the god of wisdom, but it doesn't take the god of wisdom to know that despite King Deschert's quest to overturn Celestia and seek out forbidden knowledge was brave and admirable, it was futile to say the least. To try to overturn the heavenly principles would bring untold catastrophe to the whole land of Sumeru. So doing the only thing she could, Rukkhadevada broke ties with both of her friends and returned to the forest to pursue her own ideas of wisdom. And both King Deschert and Nabu would wait her return, and this would never come. And shortly after this, Nabu's own death would come to fruition. King Deschert would then be left alone in the desert to rule over his people after the goddess of flowers' death. After Rukkhadevada cut ties with them in establishing the rainforest, she built the barrier protecting the rainforest and constructed the Varuna contraption in the section of the desert. She then created the Aranara, small plant-like creatures with the ability to control dreams. The Aranara and the Lords of the Forest used dreams and illusions to protect this contraption. Over time, Rukkhadevada would gain followers and would go on to establish the academia, and the entire rainforest of Sumeru flourished, and it expanded over time. Sumeru City was built on a divine tree, located roughly in the middle of the Sumeru rainforest region. The academia in its heyday would assist Rukkhadevada in managing the nation's affairs. Now here's a question. What does forbidden knowledge mean? Is it punishment for learning truths that people should not learn in Teyvat? Is it Celestia keeping their secrets hidden? Is it Irminsul having a virus type thing implanted in it so that people never learn what they're not supposed to, or they're corrupted and their minds go crazy? People from the desert under King Deschert all heard crazed whispers in their heads, and the disease known as Elazar manifested into the withering on human bodies, and it began to spread. Irminsul is the greatest threat in Teyvat and to everyone living within it. If you think of Teyvat like a living organism database, Irminsul is like a giant supercomputer connected to everyone and everything neurologically. If that were to be tainted or corrupted or a virus left within it, who knows the untold damage it could bring out. And despite her warnings, King Deschert and Nabu would not listen. Nabu already being deceased, and King Deschert's whole civilization on the brink, Rukkhadevada heard the plight of the people, and she came to their aid on account of her old friendship with Deschert. She instructed the people to build temples in which she infused with the divine power of life to suppress the forbidden knowledge. Doing so expanded a great deal of her own power, causing her to regress into a childlike form, similar to Nahida. But this was not enough, and in the end King Deschert sacrificed himself to finally put an end to the outbreak. Like we've learned so many times in Genshin, if you go up against the heavenly principles, define their law, or learn something you're not supposed to, whether you're Orobashi, the people of Fontaine, or King Deschert, death is all but certain. Now, Rukkhadevada being in a weakened-like state, and King Deschert's people without a strong leader and divine god to follow, his civilization would lose stability, and eventually would lead to different smaller cities establishing. Being the only survivor of the god trio left and being the best candidate to take the Dendronosis, she had no choice, and it was the best option to keep the nation of Sumeru safe, so she became the first ever Dendro Archon and the god of wisdom. Shortly after this, Rukkhadevada, in her weakened state, made a promise to one of Epep's minions to completely erase the apocalypse and the elimination of forbidden knowledge inside Epep and its minions, which only occurred because of Epep's consumption of King Deschert's corrupted body following his death. As we learned in Nahida's second story quest when we actually meet Epep, Rukkhadevada is one of the few reasons why Epep tolerates humanity and people living under the heavenly principles, having no love for the Archons or anyone that resides within this new world. This now brings us to the events of the Cataclysm 500 years ago. Rukkhadevada still being in a weakened state. During the big battle of the gods at Tunji Hollow, the main rift where all the abyssal creatures emerged from, we know that they successfully suppressed the powers of the Abyss, Conray, and all the monsters, but at a price. The original Electro Archon and the Hydro Archon would be slain. Egeria was killed, and her remains formed the waters called Omerta that we see at the gravesite. Rukkhadevata would grow that great tree that we see to anchor the previous Hydro Archon to the mortal realm, and preserve her life force and prevent the corruption within it, and to this day still seals the abyssal rift there, absorbing the corruption from it. And as if she had not done enough already, being the protector of Irminsul would be summoned there for one last job, her greatest mission of all. For Rukkhadevata was not summoned to participate in the war against Khaenri'ah, since protecting Irminsul was her most important task. The pollution of forbidden knowledge occurred alongside the disaster, and it had already invaded Irminsul and caused great distress to Rukkhadevata. She created the Akasha system to borrow her citizens' dreams and wisdom, and used what was left of her own strength a second time to clear the forbidden knowledge, like how she did with King Deshret thousands of years ago. However, she realized that because she was the avatar of Irminsul, when forbidden knowledge corrupted Irminsul, it had corrupted her very existence as well. Like we talked about in the video many times, the very idea of Irminsul being corrupted is terrifying, and what it could do to everyone in Teyvat neurologically. She would eventually die during this process, but this meant that Irminsul could not be fully purified yet, and contamination still lingered, and with that Elazar still remained a threat. She would then create Lesser Lord Kusanali as her final act from the purest branch of Irminsul, still left uncontaminated, as her next incarnation and the next Dendro Archon. Greater Lord Rukkhadevata was a fantastic leader, role model, and Archon, and was widely loved by all that resided within her nation. So much so that Lesser Lord Kusanali was never accepted the same way. The academia and the sages found her to be just a child with no real wisdom or godlike power, and disappointed with their new god. So they locked her up in the sanctuary above the Divine Tree in Sumeru City. And we pretty much know what happened from here in the story quest. Over time, the academia and the sages would misuse the Akasha system and alter the true history between Rukkhadevata and Deshret, causing strife between the people of the desert and the rainforest. Believing Rukkhadevata killed King Deshret just so she could seize power over Sumeru and created the desert out of spite. And from here we know the Traveler would become entangled in Sumeru's affairs and uncover the truth of all of this. And in the final act of the Sumeru Archon quest, and probably the most tragic thing to ever happen in Teyvat's entire history, Greater Lord Rukkhadevata sacrificed her consciousness, her memory, her very existence to remove the last bit of pollution corrupting Irminsul to protect everyone, not just people in Sumeru, but the entirety of Teyvat. And nobody would even remember she ever existed. It isn't just enough for her to save her friends, fellow Archons, preserve everything, but to sacrifice not just your life, but your very existence and memory. But what it truly means to be a savior of Teyvat, not just an Archon, but exceeding that. Rukkhadevata gave everything, her entire existence, to keep everybody safe. Genuinely heartbreaking that nobody will ever remember all of the things she did. The fact that she even preserved the first Hydro Archon's essence in Sumeru before going to save Irminsul and everyone there is truly heartbreaking, and now the Abyss Order is creating the Loom of Fate, possibly to weaponize Irminsul. Nahida, I think, does a great job following in her predecessor's footsteps. However, like the devs already answered in a Q&A and like foreshadowed, Irminsul will eventually, most likely, have to burn, probably to prevent the Abyss Order to use it and weaponize it against everyone in Teyvat. Will this mean that Lesser Lord Kusanali will have to also follow in her predecessor's footsteps by sacrificing herself in order to prevent Irminsul from being fully weaponized by the Loom of Fate? Maybe Nahida also has to die. And honestly, if it comes to that, I think Nahida would accept it, if it's for the better and greater good of everyone in Teyvat, similar to how Rukkhadevata gave her life and her own legacy and memory to safeguard Teyvat. I think Nahida would do the same. Hopefully, it doesn't come to that. And maybe, like with Natlan and the Wyab, we can find a way to save Nahida if it comes to it. Speaking of Egeria, the first ever Hydro Archon, Egeria was also known as the Mistress of Many Waters and the predecessor of Focalors. The legends state that the original Hydro Dragon was removed from its position as the heart of the primordial sea, and an unnamed Shade of Life, one of the 4 shades of the Heavenly Principles, created Egeria as the primordial sea's new heart to replace the original Hydro Dragon, so Neuvillette predecessor. And according to legend, shortly after this, the first Oceanids were born from Egeria and her tears, and the Oceanids would continue to expand. Egeria was a very benevolent god, and tasked the Oceanids to seek the understanding of the other species, to love all things and creatures. So they followed in their master's desire to connect everyone in the world. This is why you can find Oceanids across the world of Teyvat, including the most powerful of all the Oceanids, Rodadia of Locke, that it can now be found in Liyue, near Tsaritsa village. Despite Egeria actually seizing control of Fontaine, she would actually have no direct connection with the Heavenly Principles or Celestia for that matter, but the Oceanids that followed her desired to be part of civilization, live on the surface, and have a human life. Not wanting to refuse her followers and grant their wishes, she decided to fulfill their request, taking the water from the primordial sea, inserting it into their blood vessels, creating humanoid forms for them to walk on land. Unfortunately, this did not go unnoticed by Celestia, who saw this as a slap in the face and a great sin, and sentenced her to be sealed for her crimes, claiming that a prophecy would come to dissolve the people of Fontaine in order to wash their sins away. After Celestia realizing Remoria was destroyed by its conflicts and rebellions, they demanded Egeria rule over the Fontaine region specifically, but now they had a watchful eye. They also instructed her to stop the rebellions, the conflicts, and the feuds, instructing them to establish new cities, build a nation, and establish law that endured to this present day, being the nation of justice. For her efforts, she was awarded a Gnosis and descended as the Hydro Archon to become one of the 7, after establishing complete control over Fontaine. All the criminals had to be exiled, but they were miserable and they pleaded for forgiveness, which she then decided to grant their wishes for redemption, ordering them to guard her secret beneath the waves, the entrance to the primordial sea, and this would ultimately be the foundation and the beginnings of the Fortress of Meripede, the prison from Fontaine. The Fortress of Meripede to actually house and rehabilitate criminals, but also to safeguard the primordial sea entrance that only a select few from Fontaine to this day would even know about, such as Risley and Neuvillette. For the most part, it was forgotten by everyone over time. Throughout her reign though, Egeria was always fearful of this prophecy hanging over her head, so she devised a plan and assigned an Oceanid and one of her loyal followers, Focalors, to be her successor, hoping that she would be able to come up with a plan to deceive Celestia. No matter which Archon we talk about, it always comes back to the Cataclysm 500 years ago. I'm sure I don't even have to tell you at this point, but Egeria was among the gods who ventured into Twingy Hollow to combat the forces of the Abyss spawning forth from the rift. She was, however, slain and her body turned into a pool of dew called Emerta. This was due to Greater Lord Rukkhadevata preserving her life essence within the desert area. Rukkhadevata growing the great tree that we see there today, allowing Egeria's consciousness to remain anchored to the mortal realm. This marks the greatest graveyard site in Teyvat, an oasis in the harsh desert. Rukkhadevata herself, after this great battle, would have to go to Irminsul and defend it, ultimately giving her life to save everyone, the entire world. Eventually, as the corruption and defilement began taking its toll on the great tree, a great bird from the desert was forced to drink the waters that would transform itself into the limitless life forms that we see, the sentient peri beings and life forms, who began to defend and worship the great tree as their god, and can be seen there to this day. Following her death, she was immediately succeeded by the person she chose, Focalors. However, most of the Oceanids who worshipped Egeria refused Focalors as their new Hydro Archon, and ventured off into Teyvat, much like Rodadia of Locke, who can still be found in Liyue, near Tsaritsa village to this day. Now, I can only feel bad for Focalors as she pretty much inherited a terrible situation, a looming prophecy hanging over her head, and her predecessor fallen during the cataclysm. But the courts, the people, and the nation of justice had to be maintained while also coming up with a solution to deal with this prophecy in order to trick or deceive the heavenly principles. While Focalors liked to spend time on the ocean floor to think and strategize, she eventually came up with a plan that must allow Celestia to believe the prophecy being fulfilled while also saving everyone from Fontaine. But the prophecy must push forward. Her plan then was to separate her divinity and memories from her body and spirit, and named the human body that she left behind Farina. She is essentially the human version of herself, without the authority and the title and the divinity. She also placed a curse upon Farina, making her immortal as long as Focalors continued to exist, but also preventing her from pursuing her own happiness. This meant that Farina would have to endure 500 long years of this deceit, fooling the people from Fontaine and the heavenly principles simultaneously. Nobody knew the truth, being a mere mortal that must pretend she is the Hydro Archon day in and day out for 500 long years. This really goes to show the mental resolve that Farina actually had. And if Farina were to fail, Focalors' plan to deceive the heavenly principles would not only fail, but you would unleash their full wrath. As we would see in Conria, Focalors at the same time would keep her gnosis the whole time in her divine half, hiding herself within the Oratrice, accumulating energy in the device. For when the time came, she planned to use that accumulated energy to not only kill herself, but destroy the Hydro Archon Divine Throne, and do the right thing and return that authority to the predecessor of the original Hydro Dragon, the rightful ruler that should be in control of not only Fontaine but the Primordial Sea. Focalors was also responsible for Neuvillette to take upon the position of Chief Justice in the first place. She hoped that he would come to sympathize with humanity, for when the time came for her to kill herself and Neuvillette take control, he would have a better understanding of the people in the region he was to rule over. And this was a complete success, because although he's a dragon and remembers his ancestors and origin, and all the atrocities done to the dragons, he does not blame humanity, and he's a very just and fair ruler. In the end, Focalors never truly got to appreciate or even enjoy for 1 second being the Archon. She inherited a terrible prophecy and situation, but made good on her promise to her predecessor Egeria, succeeded in not only destroying the divine seat, but fooling the heavenly principles. We'd later learn that the heavenly principles have been asleep for 500 years, but only if they knew. Not only was the dragon reinstated, but a divine throne destroyed. I can't even imagine what they would do. I guess we're going to find out eventually. Which now brings us to the Pyro Nation, the nation of war, Natlan. Natlan is probably the most interesting nation to me when it comes to Archons because they've had a ton of Archons over the years. We know of 4 of them officially, and I'm sure we'll learn about more as we get more Natlan patches. Unlike the other Archons of Teyvat, the Pyro Archons are humans rather than gods. They are given divine power by winning the position through the tournament and the pilgrimage. But they are still mortals that age and die like regular humans. When they ascend to the divine throne, their inner flame will awaken, and the sacred flame grants them significant knowledge and memory of the land. More or less, they inherit the important information they need to know about Natlan when they take up the mantle. And unlike any other nation, you have to earn the position of Pyro Archon, which is why, for the most part, the Pyro Archons all seem to be pretty based, level-headed people. No gods shrouded in mystery, and they really do work for the people. The Pyro Archon also goes by the God of War, and like all Archons, their demon name Habram. Sometime towards the end of the Archon War, Natlan had its first Pyro Archon, a mortal man named Xe'Blanc. He had no special powers, but he was able to defeat the Lord of the Volcano. That volcano we can probably see in the distance. The Lord of the Volcano being known as the Lord of Flame. This Lord of the Volcano was named Shukult, but it is heavily suggested that this is the Pyro Dragon Sovereign, and this dragon was slain by the first mortal man who would ascend to become the Pyro Archon. Now, if Xiblanc would have killed the Pyro Sovereign, that's actually pretty crazy, but we know resurrection's a thing in Natlan, and similar to Fontaine, if the original Pyro Sovereign was killed, then I'm sure there would have been a successor born at some point, just like Neuvillette, for he was also not the original sovereign. It's also stated that Xiblanc borrowed the power from the heavens to set up the system and rules of Natlan that would also allow future mortals to ascend to archonhood through the Wyab and the Night Kingdom. Now, Genshin being as vague as ever, borrowed power from the heavens, huh? Now, if you've watched any of my Natlan videos recently, my Columbina video especially, I suspect the Wyab and this power from the heavens to establish the original rules of Natlan and how the pilgrimage works. This power from the heavens is the shade of death, if I was a betting man, considering how Natlan has a culture around war, death, and resurrection. Not to mention the obsidian obelisks that all the tribe communicate with the Wyab and get their commands. In Aztec culture, they use obsidian for sacrifices and death rituals. Because the Pyro Archons have a mortal life, we would have cycled through quite a bit of them. But the next one we know for sure was Murata, the Pyro Archon at least 1,000 years ago. And because Venti mentioned this Archon to Vanessa while helping her in her rebellion in Mondstadt against the aristocracy, I'm assuming he was aware of the current Pyro Archon. He is an Archon himself. Then we have Kuchenina, another ancient Pyro Archon who drove the Volcano Lord out of the land of the people of the Springs. So she was obviously from Mulanni's tribe and won the pilgrimage and became the Pyro Archon. It's said that she used clever maneuver and tricked the Volcano Lord by telling him about a treasure very deep within the ocean floor and had a surfing race to go find it, but threw an empowered pufferfish at the Lord of the Volcano, scaring them off so that they would never attack the people of the Springs again. I wonder if this new Lord of the Volcano is the original Pyro Archon revived, or similar to Neuvillette, is the successor. But that will bring us to our current Pyro Archon, Mawika, who was the Pyro Archon during the Cataclysm 500 years ago. And obviously because Natlan has a much weaker leyline system and relies on the Wyab established with the first Pyro Archon and the Heavens, Shade of Death, which I really do believe the Shade of Death is playing a part, this leaves Natlan open for attacks with the Abyss since the leylines help keep the Abyss at bay. I'm not even going to get into the details of the fact that they can now weaponize it with the Loom of Fate, Irminsul, we already talked about that, but the Cataclysm was devastating to Natlan. She made an oath with the great heroes of Natlan and its tribes back then. And according to Il Capitano in their confrontation, it has not been fulfilled yet. We know that she also had a family herself, a little sister, a mother, and a father, before she ascended into Archonhood. She had to die, only to be revived 500 years later because she is immortal and can't live that long. This was obviously the only way for her to fulfill that oath. But now she is vulnerable. She had to expel and use all of her power to keep the sacred flame alive, because the pilgrimage that powers the sacred flame cannot happen right now. Because if people die in the pilgrimage, they can't be resurrected. A little catch-22. And the captain clearly wants to take the mantle for himself, become the Pyro Archon so he can fulfill that oath himself. As stated, this was more than him just getting the Gnosis for the Tsaritsa. This is personal for him, so I can only assume he's one of these old ancient Natlan heroes. And because heroes can take the Pyro Archon mantle, I think him or the Traveler will eventually join sides to fight back the Abyss, and one of those two has the best chance to become the next Pyro Archon by the end of the Natlan quest. But I also find it interesting that in Mondstadt, the Shade of Time Istaroth plays a big part and is heavily linked with Venti. Then we have the Shade of Life that created the first Hydro Archon Egeria, and more likely than not, the Shade of Death made a deal and helped the first Pyro Archon establish the rules and laws of Natlan and the Wyab. So I wonder if Zheng Li being a descender as he's described, might be linked with the shade of void or space represented by the goblet artifact. Just something interesting to note, since he has the most mysterious origins out of all of them. As for our current Pyro Archon, I mean, it can only end one of few ways. She's either going to maintain that title by name alone, while we take the Pyro powers to Shaznia with us, along with the Gnosis. She definitely won't have a Gnosis by the end of this. Or maybe she does die in this war. Now, we did get some bombshell lore drops in the 5.1 live stream. Mawika's death is the price Natlan has to pay. And the Masters of the Nightwind and its tribe members have the closest connection to the Wyab. We met two of those characters in the live stream, and apparently Auroron is being coerced, probably by the captain. It seems that he has his own agenda in how to save Natlan. Any price is worth saving humanity, in his eyes. And we got our first look at the Pyronosis. Mawika also tells us she'll try to stall the captain. So it looks like they're both going to be trying to save Natlan in their own way. But this does give my theory on the Traveler becoming the Pyro Archon more credibility, seeing as that they're heavily hinting towards Mawika dying a second time, and perhaps maybe even staying dead this time, or at least retired if she gets resurrected. I know she will be playable, so maybe she'll just stay dead, while maybe secretly being revived and just living a normal life, and Natlan will move on without its Archon. They also refer to the Wyab as the Lord of Night. Again, an entity. The Wyab in the Night Kingdom. It has to be the Shade of Death at this point. Help from the heavens. What else could it be? And we know the Shades play a big part in a lot of regions. So maybe Hoyoverse really does kill another Himiko. But as far as Natlan and its Pyro Archon goes, that is all we really know about Mawika. One other small thing to note before we move on to Shaznia and the Tsaritsa is that she finds it strange that we have not been welcomed with open arms to most regions we go to, which is honestly kind of refreshing for an Archon to think that. And if Natlan does gift the authority and title of Pyro Archon to great heroes and war heroes of Natlan, we do actually have a good chance to become the next Pyro Archon. Maybe not by name and title, but if we inherit that power, that authority, we will have a much stronger leg to stand on when we go into the Lion's Den, the home of the Fatui Harbingers and the Cryo Archon. The Traveler definitely needs a good power boost before going to Shaznia, and Natlan is the perfect place to give us that power boost. Which now brings us to our last Archon. Since we don't actually know who the original Cryo Archon is, the Tsaritsa is the current and the one that we know the most about, clearly. And she is also the one that the Fatui Harbingers are loyal to. And this is her grand plan, probably along with Piero, to seize authority from the gods, collect each Gnosis from an Archon, and change the rules of Teyvat. Now, we really don't know much about the Tsaritsa, but we do know a few things. In the very earlier days of Genshin, in Child's Beta, it was leaked that the Tsaritsa was named Bronya. Now, I'm sure this is beta and it's probably not going to be named Bronya, even though Bronya is a Russian name and Shaznia and the Cryo region is based off Russia. I think that the Cryo Archon is just going to be an export character of Bronya. Not actually the name, they probably just substituted that for the beta. Since we have a Bronya in Honkai Star Rail, and go figure, she's the leader of a world covered in ice and snow, which I'm probably using for my background as we speak. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Honkai Star Rail used their ice world first and Genshin's is going to be last, so they don't cross wires at a similar time. We also have a Bronya in Honkai Impact 3rd, of course. But besides her being an export character of Bronya, who is the Tsaritsa? We don't actually know any other titles or names she goes by, other than the God of Love, which is heavily implied, and different translations within the game suggest that she is actually the God of Love, that according to the trailer has no love left for her people. It's not hard to speculate that the Cataclysm really changed the Tsaritsa. No doubt she probably fell in love with somebody from Conria, and everything that happened in the Cataclysm devastated her. We don't even know what side she was on, but she cut ties with all the other Archons Venti said so himself. Obviously, whatever happened here destroyed her. And I don't think she just had intense love for humanity in general. I think she might have lost someone she actually loves. As we've mentioned so many times in this video, Archons have such human qualities. They feel anguish, pain, loss. But since those days of the Cataclysm, she's become cold and a tyrant, targeting the other nations for their gnosis. She also has the ability to grant her subjects the power of delusions, usually granted to high-ranking Fatui generals or officers and, well, the Harbingers. If I had to speculate, I know we learned that the 5 sinners of Conria are what started the Cataclysm in the first place. A lot of innocent Conrians suffered and died because of this. But like the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles stated, the arrogation of mankind ends now, and we know that Conria got absolutely leveled by the Heavenly Principles. It could also be that the Tsaritsa was devastated to see the destruction of the innocents and the collateral damage that Conria received. For the most part, the Fatui Harbingers are fairly loyal to her. Some have their own agendas and their own means. Signora was loyal, Child is fiercely loyal and looks up to the Tsaritsa. I also speculate that the Rooster is the Cryo Sovereign, or the current one, and he's the mayor of Shesnaya. He even has a lot of reptilian references and is named the Rooster. And because he's the mayor of Shesnaya and the 5th Harbinger, he probably plays a similar political role within his region that Neuvillette does. But only for Shesnaya. He might only be the 5th rank, which might seem low for a sovereign, but he doesn't have his authority reinstated yet. And obviously the other 4 Harbingers are no joke either. But that is honestly all we really know about the Tsaritsa, a god with no love left for her people. And obviously because the Tsaritsa is an Archon, she'll be playable, which means she'll have some redeeming qualities. Maybe we'll be able to warm her heart, make her see that there is still love for her people. Because let's be honest, besides her being an export character of Bronya and maybe having a similar type story to other Bronyas we've seen, such as other export characters, I went over this concept in the Raidenverse video I made, but other than that we can't speculate on her backstory, how she became the Archon, all of that, but we can speculate and make some very educated guesses on how it'll play out once the Traveler reaches Shesnaya, as well as her relationship with Piero the Jester, the director of the Fatui Harbingers. Finally, I can say that in a video without getting a few comments telling me he's the first Harbinger. Exhibit A. We now know that's not true. But for years now, every region that we go to, we help solve the crisis in that region. Usually the Fatui Harbingers are a part of the problem. Sometimes they help us. But regardless, Shesnaya is going to be the first nation we go to where they don't have an immediate crisis. For God's sakes, they have the Fatui Harbingers, and have members of that organization that are more powerful than us right now. What would they need our help with? Well, that's just it. To strike a deal with us, possibly for the Pyronosis, but also, what is Project Stuja? The devs in a Q&A told us that the burning of Irminsul was a future event, not a flash or a foreshadow, like a bad dream Kali was having. No, that's a future event. With the existence of the Loom of Fate being revealed after, it's easy to see why this would be a potential threat and why they might need to do this. But the Jester, Piero, is intertwined directly with the Tsaritsa. We obviously don't know their relationship 100%, but they obviously bonded over what happened during the Cataclysm, agreeing to help her rebel against all gods in Teyvat and the Heavenly Principles. He was a royal mage in Conria, so he would have suffered firsthand the divine justice of Celestia and the destruction of his homeland. The Jester and the Tsaritsa obviously share this goal for revenge on the Heavenly Principles and ridding Teyvat of its current system. He would also have more hatred for the gods, seen as that he is from Conria, a nation not ruled by the Heavenly Principles. So your homeland being destroyed by their divine justice and wrath would obviously enrage him. It is said that he also spent some time with our Abyss sibling, but his inferiority in comparison to the 5 sinners made him fall out of favor with the monarch of Conria. And we obviously know the 5 sinners, as Dainsleif told us, accidentally or purposely caused the cataclysm, and he failed to stop it. He did warn them, but it was already too late. Being a pure Conran, he would have been cursed with immortality, and thus making a contract and a deal, a bond with the Tsaritsa for their 500-year-long plan, the one that we're seeing in motion right now. But is he going to double-cross the Tsaritsa? Is she in love with him? I don't think he is the person she loved. I think that individual might have died, causing her to do what she's doing right now, being bitter, cold, with no love left for her people. She sounds like the god of love, who is grieving. And even if she is an Archon, just like any other human that's grieving, Piero might just be manipulating the Cryo Archon for his own means. Because if the Cryo Archon is going to have a redeeming arc within Shesnaya, I highly doubt Piero is going to give up on his plans, thus meaning he might have to double-cross the Tsaritsa, which actually makes perfect sense with the timeline of Genshin Impact. There's no way they're not going to release the Cryo Archon as playable, and every Archon, whether they're good or bad, or misunderstood, has a redeeming arc by the end of that nation's quest. But Conria will be the last nation we go to after Shesnaya, which Piero will most likely be the main antagonist and Fatui member we have to deal with in that nation, seeing as that he is from Conria. And by this point, after we're done with Shesnaya, the fruits of his labor will be in full effect. We will either be trying to help or stop him. But as for his relationship with the Tsaritsa, if they are purely equals and partners, doing this together, or he has been manipulating her, well, that we'll have to wait and see. Both could be true. I just don't see the Tsaritsa being this terribly evil character, even though the Fatui have committed atrocities. She is obviously grieving, and I am very curious to learn what actually led up to her falling out with all the other Archons, and tie up all the loose ends with all of them, all of their unique experiences with the Cataclysm, the PTSD, their willingness to give up the Gnosis, give up their authority, and this impending war against Celestia. It is inevitable. Will all the Archons come together in this moment, all uniting in the rebellion, and no longer wanting to be puppets for Celestia? But as for now, that is all we know and can speculate on. This video has got to be well over an hour by the time I finish editing it. I've been recording for 2 hours, and I'm sure by now you're sick of listening to me talk, but I really do hope you enjoyed this video, maybe learned something about one of the Archons. Even though there's a lot of lore about them, there's still a lot shrouded in mystery, especially Venti and Zhongli, which I honestly hope the game does explore further. I would be a waste not to. And I am excited to hear your thoughts in the comments, as well as which Archon is your personal favorite. For me, it has to be either Ruka Devada or the current Pyro Archon. But with that, I did put a lot of work into this video, so if you did enjoy it and liked it, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. I really do appreciate you all watching this far, and as always, we will see you all in the next one. Later.